Donald Trump believes that a deal, perhaps even a peace deal, between Iran and Israel could soon be struck. He calls on the parties to this agreement. Although mutual strikes continue, Israel strikes legitimate military targets, and Iran responds by shelling peaceful areas of Israeli cities. We are talking about this right now. My name is Iryna Uzlova. This is a live broadcast on YouTube. With me today is David Sharp, a military expert from Israel. David, hello. I am sincerely glad to see you.
Iryna, hello.
Donald Trump called on Iran and Israel to conclude a deal and announced the readiness of the United States to intervene in the conflict. The US president wrote on his social network True Social that Iran and Israel are ready to agree and make the Middle East great, as he puts it, again. Interestingly, Trump, after all the events in America, protests and other challenges, is now saying that the war between Israel and Iran is in full swing. But he remains confident that a deal is possible. Numerous calls and meetings are taking place now. Trump even compared this situation to the confrontation between India and Pakistan, recalled Serbia and Kosovo, strange comparisons, as we have already discussed with political experts, but nevertheless. David, do you think Trump seriously believes in the possibility of a peace deal? How is this possible against the backdrop of the operation launched by Israel and especially given Iran's tough position? For example, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Raqi said that the country needs a peaceful atom and, apparently, nuclear weapons.
This is the main point. By the way, President Trump's statements, as we have observed over the past few months, on the one hand, cannot be simply ignored. When the U.S. president says something, it always carries significant weight. However, on the other hand, many of his remarks should not be taken literally, as if they necessarily indicate that something is actually happening or that the likelihood of it is very high. I will say more. In the specific and delicate situation unfolding between Israel and Iran, President Trump has been actively involved over the past several days and weeks. What's notable is that his involvement appears to have been clearly coordinated with Israel, seemingly as part of a broader disinformation campaign. In other words, he has already been informed of some of the planned steps. Still, his statements created an illusion for Iran that negotiations were continuing despite Tehran's rejection policy, and that Israel had a red light to allow concessions. As a result, the Iranians have become captive to these misconceptions. Today, it can be stated without any doubt or ambiguity that Ukrainians, drawing from their direct and often harsh experience in the ongoing war against Russia, are fully aware of the fact that behind the scenes there is a continuous and careful probing of the situation by various countries and interested stakeholders. Certain messages are passed between parties, and suddenly, stories emerge of negotiations that no one had heard of before, which at first glance may seem like an unexpected turn of events. All of this is undoubtedly happening, but in any matter, what is important is not the negotiations themselves. Negotiations are not an end in themselves, it is the result that matters. From Israel's perspective, there are certainly specific demands and understandings. When Israel made the fateful decision to enter into war with Iran, it was an event of colossal significance. I mean a large-scale, direct war, because warfare by other means had already been taking place for many years, with varying degrees of escalation. When that decision was made, it was based on the understanding that there was no alternative. Otherwise, Iran would draw significantly closer to developing a nuclear bomb and simultaneously increase its missile capabilities. That would pose a threat to Israel's very existence, especially if we are speaking of a nuclear bomb. Accordingly, unless those conditions are lifted, there can be no serious discussion. A significant portion of those conditions has already been addressed through military action, that is, Iranian capabilities have been pushed back for a period of time, not destroyed, but indeed pushed back. The process is ongoing, and it is unlikely that anyone will stop before it is completed. Moreover, there is another point. The Iranians have thus far refused to accept the demands of Israel and, for example, of the United States, to dismantle their nuclear program in such a way that they would not be close to creating nuclear weapons. They have insisted, for instance, on a key issue, enriching uranium on their own territory. They were offered a compromise solution through a joint consortium, for example, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where they would have received a measured quantity of uranium for peaceful purposes. They refused, and the reasons for that are obvious. They require unmeasured amounts of uranium for purposes that are far from peaceful. They did not invest tens of billions of United States dollars and lose hundreds of billions due to sanctions, only to stop short of war with Israel. What they seek is nuclear weaponry to pose a threat not only to Israel, but to other countries as well. Thus, the entire issue hinges on whether one of the parties, the United States, Israel, Iran, and so on, will fundamentally change its position. If not, then all negotiations amount to mere background noise and commotion. But if one party has truly shifted its stance and moved closer to the opposing side, then there is something to discuss, and that could carry great significance.
So, David, as you see it, is Israel now truly prepared to go all the way? Or, after all, as CNN reports, is this operation calculated not in days, but rather in the span of a week? In any case, it will, in one way or another, become exhausted and revert to its frozen yet perpetually dangerous phase thereafter.
At the time the operation was being prepared, broadly speaking, one could say 20 years or several months, and in fact, both statements would be accurate. It was not prepared on a whim or based on chance. It was not an improvisation. Billions of dollars have been invested not only in the development of new weapons systems but also in refining tactical approaches, deploying advanced intelligence capabilities deep within Iran, gathering extensive and detailed data, and pushing forward the advancement of cutting-edge military technologies. Based on this enormous and comprehensive body of information, critical decisions were made, ranging from determining which specific targets must be eliminated to establishing the minimum acceptable thresholds for action. The level of detail considered was so precise that even seemingly minor aspects, such as the exact color of the tablecloth in an Iranian scientist's office, were taken into account. Until this minimum objective is met, the operation will not be concluded. This is not an operation against terrorists, and not something that can be halted, restarted 27 times, and so on. That is a crucial point. As for the notion of to the end, in this case, it does not quite apply. There is a certain minimum, and there are boundaries that define a hypothetical maximum. The minimum objectives will be carried out in any case. The maximum, however, is a more complex matter. The maximum could include, for example, the destruction of an Iranian port crucial to the economy in Bandar Abbas, the disruption of all import-export routes, and the targeted elimination of oil refining and energy infrastructure to a significant extent. Such steps would set Iran's economy back by decades and might destabilize the regime as well as dramatically reduce its resources. However, Israel has not taken such steps, at least not yet. Israel has acted strictly against military and nuclear sites, while occasionally signaling to Iran that broader options are also on the table. I emphasize, occasionally, as of the moment we speak. The problem is that Iran is openly attacking the civilian population, residential neighborhoods, and cities. For instance, just last night, the night preceding this very conversation, there were a series of significant and coordinated strikes carried out on 3 separate populated areas, each resulting in considerable damage and drawing widespread attention. One of the locations in question was an Arab village in the northern part of the country, where, as is often said, albeit not in politically correct terms, the local Muslim population is generally not known for demonstrating a high level of loyalty or allegiance to the State of Israel. 4 women were killed there. In Bat Yam, a satellite city of Tel Aviv, a residential building was destroyed. At least 6 people died there, and others may still be trapped under the rubble. I assure you, in the 3rd location there were no casualties, and there were absolutely no military facilities anywhere near those cities. Therefore, Iran must pay a high price for its deliberate actions against civilians. From the Israeli standpoint, this may warrant an escalation in scope and an expansion of the attacks. It is difficult to predict the future course of events, but it is important to understand this. Even Israel's minimum objectives cannot be accomplished in 2 days, they will take longer. Furthermore, much depends on the position of the United States. If the Americans choose to intervene actively from a military standpoint, that would be one scenario. If Iran chooses to attack U.S. military bases, as it has periodically threatened, that would be another, though the outcome could be similar. Iran has also made threats to target other countries, so there are many unknowns. As far as Israel is concerned, it is not undertaking anything that could easily be halted midway. Until the core infrastructure is not only targeted but completely destroyed and rendered fully inoperable, no side involved in the conflict will be willing to back down or cease its operations.
David, speaking about the involvement of the United States, Axios reports that Israel is asking the Trump administration to join the war against Iran in order to dismantle its nuclear program. Israel lacks the bombs and heavy bombers needed to destroy deeply buried sites like the uranium enrichment facility in Fordow, which is built into a mountain. Meanwhile, we see Trump stating that if Iran attacks American targets specifically, then his response would be something the world has never witnessed before, on a level never seen. What would need to happen for Trump's involvement to escalate fully, and could that distract from the war in Ukraine, both militarily and in terms of support? Pete Hegseth has reported, some air defense systems have already been redeployed from our region to Israel.
Regarding Axios, in this case, represented by Israeli journalist Barak Ravid, who, incidentally, is not without bias, though that is a separate conversation. He certainly has certain connections. From a military standpoint, the optimal scenario would be the destruction of Iranian military installations and the dismantling of its nuclear program with the involvement of the United States. However, the Americans have their own interests and approaches, and Israel cannot dictate terms or make overly insistent requests. In the end, the Americans will decide on their own. At present, they are assisting Israel in intercepting drones, and in some areas, in intercepting ballistic missiles. Specifically, the THAAD and Patriot batteries stationed on Israeli territory are helping. That said, the main burden lies with Israel's missile defense systems, and for that, the United States deserves sincere appreciation. At this point in time, the overall situation remains quite unclear and uncertain. When it comes to specific targets, there are indeed certain locations or assets that Israel is currently not physically capable of destroying unless, of course, some unforeseen developments or changes occur that could alter the circumstances. Eliminating other targets requires more time because unlike, say, American aircraft carriers or cruise missiles, Israel must operate at distances of 1,500 kilometers and beyond, traversing the airspace of other countries, contending with aircraft payload limitations and time-on-target constraints due to in-flight refueling. So, there is certainly a challenge here. We shall see what comes next. Regarding the connection to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, whether direct or indirect, Israel did not receive any air defense systems that were supposedly taken from Ukraine. That particular interpretation of P. Hegseth's statement is somewhat questionable and misleading. In reality, Israel has not been given anything that was originally designated or intended for Ukraine's use. The THAAD and Patriot missile batteries currently deployed in Israel are American systems, and according to various foreign sources, they are operated by U.S. military personnel who are there to provide allied support. In other words, we are not talking about weapon systems that had been supplied to Ukraine and were then reallocated. Concerning air defense and its relevance to Ukraine, here is what can be said. The very short-range laser-guided missiles, of which a package of 20,000 was intended for Ukraine, appear to have been partially redirected by the Pentagon to serve the needs of U.S. Central Command. Whether these missiles were delivered to Israel is unknown. In fact, there is no publicly available information suggesting that Israel possesses them. I do not rule it out entirely, but there has been no reporting on it. American leaks suggest that the missiles were recalled to the Middle East a few days before the outbreak of war, when the United States became aware of Israel's intent to strike Iran. That development significantly increased the likelihood of either a direct Iranian attack on U.S. forces stationed in the region or the urgent necessity for immediate and direct U.S. military engagement, which could include the interception and neutralization of Iranian drones actively operating in the area. These missiles, which are mounted on F-15 and F-16 fighter jets, represent a relatively inexpensive yet highly effective weapon designed for mass deployment against drones. Standard air-to-air missiles tend to be quite costly and are available only in limited quantities, whereas this alternative provides a much more affordable option while maintaining reasonable effectiveness, and that is precisely what makes it so important. It can certainly be stated that, in this context, Ukraine's overall defense capabilities have been impacted. At the very least, the Ukrainians have received fewer of these missiles than initially anticipated or hoped for. Not necessarily the entire package of 20,000 missiles. As far as I understand, the deliveries were planned to be staggered and distributed over a period of time rather than arriving all at once. It is possible that a portion of the shipment has already been delivered. However, at this point, I cannot confirm the full or exact total number of missiles that have been received so far. This capability is a significant element in Ukraine's efforts to combat the Shahed drones, albeit one of very short range and with limited capacity. It is one of the few such systems available. While this is not a decisive or critical factor on its own, the reality remains that certain weaponry, which would have been highly useful and beneficial to Ukraine's defense efforts, was apparently redirected to U.S. forces stationed in the Middle East. This decision was made based on a careful assessment of priorities, given the escalating threat of direct military involvement in that region.
Naturally, there have been more than abundant strikes by Iran on legitimate military targets in Israel, as well as Israeli strikes on lawful military targets within Iranian territory. For example, in the Iranian city of Isfahan, reports indicated the destruction of a Shahed drone manufacturing facility. Israel also eliminated Shahed Electronics Industries, a company responsible for producing nearly all radar systems in Iran. The Israel Defense Forces completed a large-scale series of strikes in Tehran, targeting infrastructure associated with Iran's nuclear weapons development program and fuel storage depots. According to the Israel Defense Forces, the targets included the headquarters of the Ministry of Defense of Iran, the headquarters of the ESSA Pan-D nuclear project, as well as additional sites that supported the Iranian regime's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons, and locations where the regime had hidden its nuclear archive. Senior Israeli military officials told Israeli media, "We carried out strikes on 2 Iranian fuel facilities used to support military and nuclear operations. We still have a long list of untouched targets. We could probably name them all until nightfall." And that is not to mention high-ranking officials, numerous members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Iranian government. How rapid are these strikes? Truly, especially on the same Shahed drone factories, recognizing that such production facilities are likely dispersed across various locations. Still, this also becomes a disadvantage for Russia, and we are already feeling the impact.
Some of the strikes were highly targeted, particularly when it came to the elimination of members of the military command. It is important to note that the political leadership was not touched. This option had been considered, but the decision was made to focus on military targets or, for example, those nuclear scientists who are formerly civilians but are directly involved in the development of Iran's nuclear weapons program. These are key figures in that program and are regarded as legitimate military targets. The government, including the supreme leader, was not targeted, though this approach may change depending on his orders to strike Israeli civilian populations. The question, however, is whether such an opportunity would even arise, since during wartime, once the element of surprise is lost, achieving such a result is difficult, not impossible, but certainly difficult. Thus, the operations that required an element of surprise were carried out during the initial strike. What followed has been a systematic implementation of the attack plans and broader strategy. At times, of course, there has been a need to deviate from initial planning, all in line with the broader objective, particularly the neutralization of a significant portion of Iran's air defense systems. This has been a critical component of the entire operation, because once air defenses are suppressed, freedom of action inside Iranian territory increases and operational risk declines. While air defenses have not been completely destroyed, the threat has been significantly reduced, allowing for the use of more aircraft and a wider range of munitions, not just expensive, long-range weaponry. In this context, one can speak of certain achievements. Unfortunately, the speed and scale of the operation are not what they might have been had Iran been geographically closer to Israel. The need to operate far beyond its borders inevitably limits some of Israel's intelligence capabilities, restricts aircraft payloads, range, and the number of aircraft that can be deployed simultaneously, and complicates, or in some situations outright prevents, special operations forces from being used at all. All of this is, to put it mildly, quite complex. Yet it was prepared for over a long period, with great seriousness, particularly in terms of intelligence gathering capabilities, identifying targets, classifying them, and understanding how to reach them. whether by sabotage methods, long-range strikes, or through closer engagement if necessary.
As for Russia now, how much does it gain or lose from this war, and who can it help? Trump, Iran, or no one?
It is difficult to say definitively. Take Russia, for example, the simplest case. On the one hand, oil prices are surging, and in that respect, Russia has benefited, at least locally. On the other hand, how many times have oil prices risen due to obvious reasons, hidden motives, or various triggers? If Russia is not receiving certain military supplies from Iran, and that is likely to remain the case in the near future, then Russia stands to lose. If Russia, at Iran's request, is forced to transfer anything to Tehran, considering Iran as a key strategic partner, it becomes a double-edged sword. One side means relinquishing something, which is a loss. The other means preserving trust and a strong relationship with a partner, which is a gain. There are many factors to consider here. Some argue that the media attention shift away from Russia benefits Moscow. My counterargument is this: yes, the media narrative has shifted, but the leadership of various nations continues to monitor and address the challenges they view as important. For countries where the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia holds critical and far-reaching significance, it is possible that certain newspapers or media outlets might temporarily shift their focus or editorial priorities. However, those decision-makers and individuals who truly need to stay well-informed continue to act consistently and strategically in accordance with their core national interests, regardless of any new developments or changing circumstances. In short, there are both clear advantages and notable drawbacks for outside players involved in the conflict, including Russia. It is entirely possible that Moscow will try to position itself as a mediator in the ongoing situation, although, at this point in time, there are many actors attempting to mediate or serve as intermediaries to transmit messages between the opposing sides. This mediation process is indeed underway, but its true depth, effectiveness, and potential outcomes remain difficult to accurately assess for now. As for President Trump, he has a very specific view of the situation. As we know, he insisted until the final day of negotiations on dismantling a key component of Iran's nuclear program. To say now that Trump has won or lost something would be premature. In any case, it was not the United States that attacked Iran, it was Israel. Trump can observe from the sidelines, remind Tehran of its intransigence, and suggest that change is still possible if Iran chooses to cooperate. Ultimately, it all depends on specific actions and outcomes. Regarding Russia, if it is indeed experiencing certain shortfalls or difficulties, then on one hand, we can observe the recent rise in oil prices as a potential economic benefit. However, on the other hand, very few aspects in our complex world can be considered unequivocally good or bad, especially when taking a comprehensive and nuanced view of the overall situation.
David, everything can be viewed from different perspectives, and not necessarily through a negative lens. The New York Times writes that the operations carried out by Israel and Ukraine, including drone strikes launched from within enemy territory and the internal sabotage of key infrastructure, are effectively reshaping the nature of warfare and demonstrating the effectiveness of such uniquely orchestrated special operations. Indeed, this is neither synergy nor duplication. Rather, it is collaboration and the application of cutting-edge technologies and modern principles of combat. And what do these actions show us? That the enemy has no secure facilities in its rear, neither yours, nor ours. No one today can guarantee absolute security, not even by 100%.
No one has 100% clarity. But anyone engaged in warfare, or facing imminent threat, must consider how to guarantee their own security and take maximum steps toward that goal. These operations have vividly demonstrated that if a military force or nation is unprepared, especially when facing an adversary that combines relatively new and advanced technologies alongside conventional operational tactics, the risk of suffering significant strategic damage becomes very real and unavoidable. This serves as a clear warning about the critical importance of readiness and adaptability in modern warfare. Iran has clearly suffered such damage. Russia has, too. And that is a shared consequence. This includes the deployment model of unmanned aerial vehicles from hostile territory, where they are secretly delivered and later activated either remotely or via local agents. It is worth highlighting the following. Our colleagues in journalism frequently exaggerate. They are fond of expressions like changing the course of the war. But, in truth, the fundamentals of warfare do not shift that easily. Certain methods and tactics evolve, warfare adapts over time as new tools emerge. For instance, in the past, acts of sabotage typically involve physically infiltrating a facility and manually placing explosives to cause damage. While this traditional method still occurs today, modern developments have introduced new capabilities that allow an attacker to infiltrate and compromise a target remotely, without ever having to come into direct physical contact with the facility or equipment. This represents a significant evolution in the nature of sabotage and operational tactics. These options have existed for years, they simply needed to be integrated into a coherent operational strategy, which is exactly what the security service of Ukraine demonstrated, especially in the large-scale case involving Iran. That particular operation was expansive, loitering munitions were involved, along with anti-tank guided missiles with television guidance. Strike teams targeted enemy systems, including ballistic missiles and tactical air defenses, in various regions of Iran. It appears that some Iranian scientists, and possibly commanders, were eliminated by these systems, not solely by airstrikes. In essence, the fundamental principle remains the same as it has always been throughout history, to infiltrate enemy territory covertly and carry out a surprise attack using whatever means and resources are available at that particular moment in time. Whereas in the past this might have involved something as simple as a barrel of gunpowder, today the range of options has expanded significantly to include modern technology such as drones, which can be deployed with precision and from a distance. Israel, incidentally, used this web-like strategy as early as February of the year 2022, just days before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In one region of western Iran, if memory serves, a drone manufacturing plant and storage facility were attacked. They were destroyed by unidentified kamikaze drones, which had not traveled from afar. There have been several other similar incidents, clearly involving individuals operating from within Iran, who either launched drones or remotely activated weapon systems. One notable example occurred in 2019, when the head of Iran's military nuclear program was assassinated by a machine gun mounted on a parked pickup truck. Remarkably, there was no one physically behind the trigger. The weapon was remotely controlled and had been strategically positioned in advance, lying in wait for his convoy to pass by.
David, we are seeing that strikes are also being carried out against military targets within the territory of the Russian Federation. Yelabuga, within the Alabuga zone, is under continuous attack. While not everything is destroyed outright, targeted action is clearly underway. And now we are even reaching as far as Kaliningrad. Sabotage operations are damaging major defense industry facilities there. Russian power substations in Kaliningrad are being disabled, and even military-industrial infrastructure is losing power in that region. Yet Putin, it seems, pays no attention to any of this. He presses on with his offensive, continues forward, albeit without much success. He appears convinced that he will reach the border of Dnipro region. Various military reconnaissance and sabotage groups are entering, claiming to already be present, but in reality, they are not. What we are seeing is activity in Sumy region and pure provocation. What is the Russian army counting on now, according to your estimates?
I believe that the Russian army and President Putin are counting on the same general strategy as before. He is aiming to achieve at least a minimum set of objectives. There are minimum goals and maximum goals. The maximum objectives may depend on circumstances, while the minimum objectives involve steady advancement and identifying weak spots. I am referring here specifically to the battlefield. When those vulnerabilities are found, he tries to move through them more rapidly. At the same time, he is making a calculated bet that during the long months over which this slow and grinding process continues to unfold, both sides, Ukraine and Russia, will gradually become increasingly exhausted. He is fully aware that Russia's own military and economic capabilities are steadily diminishing, yet he is counting on Ukraine reaching a breaking point sooner, not only due to internal strain and resource depletion, but also because of a possible decline in sustained international support and solidarity. In that case, as I see it, he will reassess the situation over time and decide whether it is worth entering negotiations, or whether he still has reserves and strategic prospects. If he concludes that there is potential, he will continue. What I mean is, he is not seeking peace. He believes Ukraine is weakening at a faster pace, and he is satisfied even with the limited progress achieved thus far. Because, according to his logic, negotiations can resume in 6 months, but from a more favorable position. He is certainly closely monitoring and paying attention to the Ukrainian strikes and their consequences. However, Putin is not the kind of political figure who would openly display concern or allow anyone to see that he is worried. His public image relies on projecting control and confidence, regardless of the actual situation behind the scenes. He may indeed be troubled by them, but no one is making a spectacle of it. It is painful, physically, symbolically, and in terms of media perception. The task of the Ukrainian armed forces and security services, as I see it, is to ensure these actions are systemic, large-scale, and produce real effect, not just media impact. Their actions should have a direct influence on what happens on the battlefield and on how Russia targets Ukrainian infrastructure. That means the overall scale and intensity of the strikes are crucial, just as important as the ongoing improvements in the precision, reach, and effectiveness of the munitions used. And in cases where conventional weaponry is physically incapable of reaching targets from Ukrainian-controlled territory, special service agents or elite special forces take over, employing inventive strategies and demonstrating remarkable boldness in executing their missions.
West of the city of Pokrov in the Donetsk region, the armed forces of the aggressor state, Russia, are attempting infantry assaults using motorized equipment, noted Ukrainian army officer Shahed Sikarsky. The occupying forces have failed to achieve success. So what can we currently say about their technical support and armament for this summer offensive, which, as we understand, is a key focus for President Putin? Do they possess sufficient resources, both in terms of personnel and military hardware?
When asking what for, the key question becomes, what exactly do they have sufficient resources for? For a rapid breakthrough? An attempt to collapse the front line and seize, for example, a regional administrative center? There is no reason to believe they have the resources to achieve that. Moreover, they are not even operating with that kind of objective. We do not see the presence of numerous reserves forming a large strike group capable of executing a large-scale breakthrough or maneuver warfare. And we have not observed anything of that kind for 1.5 years since the start of the Russian offensive, or even longer, since the autumn of the year 2023. However, they do have reserves and capabilities for actions that could be described as pressing forward, grinding down positions on certain sections of the front, probing for weak points, and, upon finding them, advancing sharply by the standards of this war. These are not deep penetrations, but the seizure of Kurakov and Seladov, for instance, can be regarded as serious territorial gains. The rapid withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from parts of the Kursk region also reflects their ability to secure localized success. These are precisely the kinds of scenarios on which they are relying. It is likely that we will see further attempts of this nature throughout the summer offensive. These operations are sustained primarily by manpower, drone support, and artillery fire. These operations are primarily supported by manpower, drones, and artillery fire. Air support, in the classical sense of manned aviation, plays a secondary role. Their situation with equipment is poor, which is, naturally, a result of the declining production and repair of Soviet-era machinery, and in some places, a complete halt. The pace of new production remains low. However, it is important to understand that the Russian army and its leadership are adapting to these conditions. For instance, in the absence of sufficient equipment, they are placing emphasis on infantry. Moreover, they are actively deploying fast civilian vehicles, such as motorcycles. This kind of improvisation, combined with a readiness to accept heavy losses, sometimes proves effective. For actors for whom losses are especially painful, such tactics, where soldiers essentially attack on a one-way mission, would be unacceptable. For Russia, however, this has proven tolerable, and we are seeing that it delivers a certain result. At the present time, the primary pillars of Russia's military capability consist of two main elements, manpower and fire support, which includes drones and artillery systems. By manpower, we mean the total number of individuals they are able to mobilize and deploy each month to maintain their combat operations. As long as the number of casualties on the front line does not consistently surpass the number of new recruits being enlisted into contract service, they are able to sustain their offensive operations, at least when it comes to available human resources and manpower. From a technical perspective, they rely in part on North Korean supplies, which account for several dozen % of Russia's ammunition stockpile, a substantial figure. They also draw from old reserves. What comes next remains unknown. Apparently, the Kremlin itself intends to reassess the situation in a few months, whether to continue in the same direction, pursue negotiations, shift tactics, or possibly resort to mobilization. Mobilization would be an extremely unfavorable step from an economic, domestic political, and other points of view, but from a purely military perspective, it has clear utility. Nevertheless, they are avoiding it precisely because they believe the manpower currently being attracted through substantial financial incentives is still sufficient to maintain an acceptable level of combat activity. As for what happens next, no one can say.
Yes, there may well be an even larger mobilization ahead. President Putin has already sacrificed more than 1 million lives, and of course, shows no compassion, makes no count. We'll keep observing. David, thanks for the thoughtful conversation and your time. Wishing you all the best. Take care.
Thank you, Iryna. Take care, and may your day be calm and peaceful. Goodbye.
David Sharp, military analyst and commentator from Israel. Thank you, friends, for spending this time with us. Over 2,000 people watched us live on YouTube 24. Leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe. Take care. We'll see you again, and we will win.